On the night of the 13th of June 1944, the crew of Wellington bomber HE-270 took off from Tortorella, Allied base near Foggia, southern Italy. The aircraft joined 16 other Wellington bombers on a night mission to attack the main railway station at Munich, Germany, a major enemy transport hub. 2 of the 17 bombers had to turn back, and 1 was shot down. My grandfather, Flight Sergeant Gordon Mansbridge, was a navigator on the aircraft, hit by German gunfire. This is my grandfather's story of that night. Could you tell us about your 33rd operation on the 13th of June 1944?
The operation on the 13th, I actually bailed out in the early hours of the 14th of June. What happened was that we had our normal briefing, and just prior to that we were met at the entrance to the briefing room by our squadron leader, who was in company with a young pilot officer who had just finished his training and was coming with us on his first operational trip, coming with us as an experienced crew. So instead of having 5 people on board, there were actually 6. We took off for a raid on Munich, marshalling yards and railway station, and we were supposed to be flying at 14,000 feet until we got over the worst of the mountains and the Alps, and then to drop down to 12,000 feet for our bombing run. This we did, but there was a lot of flak over Munich, and I think a piece of flak hit us in our starboard engine, which a minute or so later, on the start of our return journey, we had to close down our starboard engine. So on one engine, we had to get over part of the Alps and the Dolomites. I then called up the pilot and said, look, in 15 or 18 minutes we're going to be over the Adriatic. I don't fancy getting my feet wet. So he said, oh, well, neither do I. Give us a course to keep us over land, which I did. And we'd only just gone onto that new course when our port engine stopped completely and we had to get out. Everybody was ready for it. The rear gunner obviously gets out of his rear turret by swinging his turret round, and he goes out backwards. The extra man, the young pilot officer we had on board, went down to an escape hatch in the bottom near the rear of the aircraft, so that meant there were 4 of us to get out of the front. The bomber went out almost immediately. He was quickly followed by our wireless operator, and I got down to follow him, and the pilot was leaving his seat at the time. He let go of the control column, and obviously I suppose we lost flying speed, so the aircraft dipped down, and I went forward so that my head was beyond the aperture of the getting out section. I had to push myself back and then let myself go. And sort of working backwards, I would guess that I probably bowed out at something like 3,500 feet. And I reckon that my chute probably fully opened at about 2,000 feet, and it took me about a minute and a half before I hit the ground. Now the pilot who was going to follow me out, of course it's very difficult to know exactly what happened because the aircraft was not only just dipped down, but for all we know, it could have gone over to one side or the other. It might have made it much more difficult for him to get out, but he didn't make it. Unfortunately, his parachute was only partly opened and he was killed. And the unfortunate part about that was that he was a comparatively new pilot to me. I had only met him a fortnight previously, and he was full of beans at the time because he'd just heard from South Africa that his wife had given birth to their first child. So it was all rather distressing in that way. Anyway, I landed. It was completely dark. I couldn't even see the ground I was standing on. But I managed to pull my chute in, took my harness off, walked a few yards in the direction I was facing. Something loomed up in front of me. It was a hedge. So I put my parachute down, the harness on top of it, turned round, started to walk back the way on the opposite direction to which I'd found the hedge, and thought I could hear water running in front of me. I didn't want to fall down a gully or something, so I turned right, and there was a big block of cut stones there, and my night vision then started to return, and in front of me was a little sloped down to a small lane, and I went down there, turned left down the lane, and then saw in front of me a bridge over a canal. So I went across the bridge, came against a stranded wire fence, on the other side of which was a railway line, and in the far distance I could see the remains of my aircraft burning. So I went back over the bridge, the opposite way to I'd come, and just before the slope that I'd gone down was a little grassy area and a little copse of trees and shrubs. And I went in there, groped my way in. It got completely dark again, but I found a wall and realised that it was a retaining wall between the lower level I was now standing on and the higher level on which I'd landed. So anyway, I made a bit of space for myself, sat down on top of this wall in this copse, and decided what I was going to do. The obvious thing from the start was to go to Yugoslavia, where partisans held great areas of the country anyway. Anyway, I had a cigarette, thought about other alternatives, most of which were a bit stupid, and after about 5 or 10 minutes I went out of the copse in the opposite direction to which I'd entered it, and it was now starting to get light, and in front of me was an open area, but dotted about at intervals were big shrubs or small trees, and I was heading towards the sun, and I suppose I'd gone about 200 or 300 yards, and I suddenly heard an engine coming towards me from the other side of the canal. I thought first of all that it was a train, which surprised me. Then when I listened again, I realised it wasn't a train, it was a truck. So I made my way to the nearest of the small trees, knelt down on one knee and waited, and the truck got closer and closer, and then all of a sudden the top half of the truck came into sight on the other side of the canal, and I could just about make out two figures in the driving cab, and in the back of the open truck was about a dozen German soldiers. So anyway, that went past, and I thought, well, I better wait on a minute or two in case another truck was following. Nothing else came, so I continued my walk, and then noticed the back of a couple of houses on the other side of the canal, and on my side, two men were coming towards me, one behind the other. The first one just sort of nodded, and I nodded back. I was at the time not in Air Force Blue, but in khaki, because we'd only recently come from North Africa and they hadn't changed their uniforms. The second man, a few yards behind the first, gave me a cheery buongiorno, and I said the same back to him.
Since you were crashed in Italy, did you know any Italian?
I spoke a little bit of Italian. I tried to learn it, as much Italian as I could once we moved over to Italy. So I thought, well, I'd ask him if he'd got any water, and he said, no, I'm sorry, I haven't got water, but he pointed to a house behind him and said, if you go there, they'll give you water. So I went over to the house and knocked on the door. I heard footsteps come down, obviously bare wooden stairs, and the door opened, and a middle-aged woman opened the door, and I told her who I was. Immediately said, come in, and I went inside. She closed the door, she led me upstairs, and at the top of the stairs, right on the other side of the landing, was an open door, took me in there, and it was a room completely bare, except at the far left-hand side was a table with 4 chairs round it. And she asked me to sit down, so being a bit careful, I went round the far side of the table so that I could see the door, because I didn't know who else was in the house. And I sat down, and she was looking at me intently and asked me if I'd like a coffee and something to eat. I said, oh, that would be great. So she goes out down the landing. I heard her talking to somebody else, and a young female voice answered her. And a minute or two later, I heard water running. And down the landing comes her daughter, I suppose she was about 16, 17, comes into the room with a bowl and holding a cloth, comes to the side of the table where I was sitting and puts the bowl down, just water, and she asked me to turn round on the chair, and I looked at her and I said, no, what is it? Because I didn't know. She said, you don't know what's happened to you? I said, well, no. She said, wait a minute. Goes out, comes back a few seconds later with a piece of mirror, holds it up to me, and I got dirt all over my forehead and a big graze over my left eye. So she said, now you understand? I said, oh yes, sporco, dirty. She said, molto sporco, very dirty. Anyway, she then puts the cloth in the bowl, wrings it out, and starts to clean me up. And she did this 2 or 3 times, and I suppose on the 3rd time there might have been a bit of excess water in the cloth, and it dribbled down into my eye, and I sort of winced a bit. Oh, she said, I'm sorry. And then I made my first mistake. Having been in South Italy with all the British and American troops, everybody used okay, like we would today, including most of the Italians. And I said to her, oh, it's okay. So she had the most beautiful eyes, this girl. They weren't almond-shaped like normal eyes. They were round and very, very large. And she looked at me when I said, okay. And I realised it probably not an expression that they used up there. So I said, oh, they're Benny, it's all right. So she repeated again, okay. And then finished washing my face and that, put the cloth all around it, and then left. And I said, oh, you're a good, and I was trying to think of the Italian word for nurse, and I couldn't, so I said, like in hospital. And she trigged on, she said, oh, infermiera, the Italian word for nurse. And she then said, oh, I'm no nurse, and gave me a grin. Goes out down the landing, and I heard her talking to her mother, and I couldn't hear what they said, except I heard her say something about infermiera. And the next minute, the mother comes down into the room, comes up to the table, stops just short of it, and she's looking at me, and she said, oh, you hurt yourself coming down by parachute. So it was straining my Italian a bit, so I said, well, I came to the ground and did this and to indicate that I must have fallen forward. So she said, oh, I understand, but your hands, and for the first time I looked, both hands were filthy dirty. I'd probably scraped along the ground when I landed. So she said, well, wait a minute, close to the door. And I don't know the name of the girl to this day, but I thought I heard her use the name of Roseanne, and said something about Iglesias got dirty hands, water and cloth. So Roseanne, if that was her name, comes back into the room, and the mother had moved a chair, which is right on the other side of the table to me, to the very corner of the table. And Roseanne comes up with a cloth and bowl, brings the cloth out, having dipped it in the bowl, and I assumed she was going to give it to me so that I could wash my hands. Instead of which, she grabs my wrists, turns my hand over and starts to clean both sides of my hand. And I was taken a bit by surprise and looked at the mother, and she just nodded towards her daughter and said, your nurse. Anyway, then Roseanne said, oh, the other hand, so I took that, and I felt a bit of an idiot sitting there in my uniform and be having my hands washed by a young girl. But anyway, she did that and then said, oh, all nice and clean now. And then I suddenly had a funny thought. I half expected her to say, now you're not to go out and play parachutes anymore. Anyway, she left, and the mother pushed a cup of coffee and some bread and cheese and meat towards me to eat. And I started to talk to her, asked her if they worked on the land. She said, yes, we do, and we also work in the house. And I said, you work in the house, so not knowing quite what she meant. Anyway, she said, oh, you finish your food and I'll show you. When I'd finished eating and having my cup of coffee, she said, I'll show you what we do in the house. Leads me down the landing, opens a door which faced down the landing. And there was a long room there with freestanding racks all the way down, shelves on each rack, and on each shelf were shallow wooden trays about 2 or 3 inches deep, each covered with some sort of greenery. And anyway, she pulls one of the trays forward, and I had a feeling that I knew what I was going to see. because when she lifted up the corner of the greenery, underneath were all worms, silkworms. Well, I didn't know the name for worms, but I knew silk. So I said, oh, setter. See, setter. This was their little home industry. They using silkworms to produce sod silk, and this was what they did, apart from working on the land. Anyway, I stepped out of the room, and the mother came out, and Roseanne was standing at the door of their kitchen opposite me, and the mother came between us and then said, would you like to stay here for a while and rest? So I said, well, no, it's too dangerous for you, because the Germans may be looking for us. I didn't say anything about that I'd seen a truck full of Germans on the other side of the canal. I didn't want to panic them. So I said, no, I should be going. So Mother started towards the top of the stairs. I shook hands and thanked Roseanne. When I got to the top of the stairs, I turned round and waved to Roseanne, who waved back. For some reason, I suddenly gave her a mock salute. I saw a big grin come on her face. Anyway, I followed the mother down the stairs. She opened the door and I looked out. Nobody in sight. Even the man that had been cutting the grass had disappeared. And I shook hands with Mother and shook her hand and started walking towards the sun. When I'd gone a few yards, I turned round. The mother was leaning out of the door and waved to me, and I waved back. And then out of the upstairs kitchen window came the head and shoulders of Roseanne. So I gave her a big wave. She started to wave back.
Camera speed, sync purposes.
Great. So, whereabouts did all of this take place? What was the name of the village? Can you remember?
Whereabouts?
Whereabouts did all this take place? What was the name of the village? Do you
This was
remember?
very roughly about 50 miles north of Venice. Slightly north of Vittorio Veneto, and a little bit east of a town called Belluno, Belluno, and it was an area which is right at the very base of the Dolomite Mountains, and I suppose we were extremely fortunate to have bailed out in that particular area. I mean, a minute or two before we would have been in the mountains, and that could have been very dangerous. Although the height of the mountains has gradually decreased as we went further south. I mean, if you bail out in the dark in the mountainous areas, even if they're only 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 feet high, it's a terrible risk at night, because if you land on the side of a steep mountain, I mean, you could tumble around, injure yourself. There's nobody around to help you very much. So we were fortunate, and a minute or two later, we would have been on the flat plain leading down towards the Adriatic and the Venice area, and it might well have been much more difficult to have got away, because there were not that many places probably to sort of hide up, and bathing out in the area at the very base of the Dolomites where we were was extremely good. It wasn't an area exactly swarming with Germans, and the people there were extremely good. Everywhere I went, I was greeted well, offered drink and food and so on. And after I left Roseanne's house, if that's the name of the girl, I came to a dried up river and turned right down the river bank and crossed the bridge and finished up going up a steep hill, and there I could hear people chopping wood amongst the trees, and I came to halfway up this very steep hill was quite a wide path, and I turned left along that, going round the side of the hill, and came to a house on the right and a big sort of like warehouse place on the left. A man was outside there feeding a few chickens that were running around. I spoke to him, he took me into the house, got me something to eat and drink. I couldn't quite make out what the food was that he'd given me with a spoon, but he then left and disappeared. I didn't know where he'd gone. And with the spoon, I tried this food. I wasn't sure whether it was cake or pudding, and when I tasted it, it was gritty, and I realised it was maize meal, and it's stuff that they call polenta. And I didn't know it then, but 4 or 5 days later, I was to have this every day for breakfast. It's very bland, and you know, I felt you could do with something like jam with it or something like that. Anyway, I ate it and had the coffee, and the next thing was that I heard heavy boots running outside towards the house, and I wondered for a minute who he'd contacted. But anyway, suddenly in the doorway, 3 young Italian boys appeared, and they had been the people that I'd heard chopping wood. Anyway, they greeted me, shook hands with me, and then this elderly man came in. He'd obviously contacted them, and he said, well, you go with them, they will see you all right. So I thanked him for what he'd done, went outside with these 3 lads, and they immediately said, we've got a little house. So I said, oh. So they took me down the far side of the hill. Halfway down was like a big shed. It had got a floor about 18 inches above the ground, and between the ground and the floor, I noticed that there were various sacks, and apparently this is where they kept their food, and they said that wind got underneath this, the floor of this shed and kept the food cool, and inside the shed was where they slept. And anyway, I spent the Wednesday afternoon talking to them. They got a meal for me in the evening, spent that night with them, and the following morning I started talking about getting away from there and heading towards Yugoslavia, and they said, "Oh, no, 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 you stay here. We will contact partisans." Now, it was the first time that partisans had been mentioned to me. So I said, "Well, you've got partisans near here?" I said, "Well, yes, not far away is a brigade." And one of them said, "I'll go and contact them this afternoon, tell them where you are, and they may have news about the rest of your crew." So I said, fair enough. Anyway, in the afternoon, one of them disappears for a couple of hours, comes back, said, "I've seen the partisan leader. He's coming to meet you tomorrow afternoon." I said, fine. So, of course, I spent the second night with them. That was the Thursday night. And just after midday on the Friday, went round down to the bottom of the hill and waited. This was like a valley, and from the other side, all of a sudden, a figure appeared and walked down, and I had to grin. He was wearing what I suppose was the Italian desert uniform, very, very light khaki. He's got a beard, rifle over his shoulder, 2 bands of ammunition, and a belt with some Italian red devils, as they call the grenades, in the belt. Anyway, he greeted me, and I said goodbye to the 3 woodcutter lads, and he then took me along the valley floor, through a small woods, where we met a couple of his partisan group, and he then got a piece of paper out and wrote a note, and he gave it to me and said, "You show this to anybody, they'll know who you are and they will help you." And I said, fine. He then pointed out the road, and he said, "You follow this road right the way through and make for a certain village called Lamazano." Anyway, I shook hands with them and left. And I was almost immediately in this open area, and I got about a third or halfway along, and I suddenly heard a plane in the distance. And it wasn't a bomber or a fighter. Sounded like a light plane, and all I could think of was it might have been something like a Fisher's spotter plane. And so I thought, well, it's not very good. I'm walking along this open area, and there was grass on both sides, mostly green, but odd patches had gone a bit sort of yellowy. And because I was wearing khaki, I thought, well, if that plane suddenly comes much nearer, I'll go onto one of these lighter patches of grass, curl myself up, lay down, curl myself up into a ball, perhaps I wouldn't be seen. Anyway, the sound of the plane gradually disappeared. I never did see it. So I continued my walk, came to this little hamlet, knocked on the first house, and a woman answered the door, and I asked her for a drop of water, which she gave me, wished me good luck. I went on further, came to another quite large village, and I noticed that in a road parallel to where I was walking was a partisan with red neckerchief. Anyway, he seemed to be following me from this other road, and I stopped, and I could only assume that they were partisans. And when I got within a yard or 2 of them, I stopped, and one of them one of the three said, "Inglesi?" So I said yes. And they came forward, shook my hand. And while we were doing this, another elderly man came out of the same house, came straight up to me, and in quite a broad American accent said, "Hi, buddy, we've been expecting you." And I looked at him, I said, "You American?" So he said, "No, I'm Italian, but I spent 30 years working in the steel mills in Pittsburgh." Anyway, he then took all four of us into the house, and it was, in fact, I suppose, the village little cafe. Sat down, he gave me a coffee, and the others had a drink, and we had a talk for a while. Then he said, "One of these will take you up to the next village," which was Lemosano. And so anyway, I said goodbye to them, to the four of them, and one of the partisans took me up to Lemosano and went to the back of a house. The bottom half of a sash window was open. He climbed in through the window, asked me to do the same, and I did. And I was in the back room of this house, and all of a sudden other people appeared in, and I was introduced to the man of the house, name of Bruno, his wife Maria, Bruno's sister and her husband, and Bruno's elderly mother, and also a young girl who'd been staying there but who came originally from Naples. Anyway, we all sort of sat down and started to talk. And then two other figures suddenly climbed through the same window, and I was introduced to them. They were two boys from Slovenia, a part of Yugoslavia, and they were trying to learn English. Unfortunately, their English wasn't as good as my Italian, which wasn't saying much, I suppose. But anyway, we all sat down and started to chat, and then Maria, Bruno's wife, suddenly said to me, "Would you like to have a shave?" So, God, I hadn't shaved since. This was now a Saturday morning, and I hadn't shaved until the morning of the operation, which was the previous Tuesday. So I said, "Oh yes, I would like to have it." So Bruno and his brother-in-law go out, come back with a shaving mug and brush and some water and a towel. And I was able to have a shave. I don't quite know how many acres of beard that what do you call it? If you've been through the shaving stick had been over, but it seemed to be a bit blunt. But anyway, I persevered and had my shave, and they took the stuff away, and I dried my face on that. And then when I turned the chair round again and facing Maria and the others, and Maria suddenly said to me about my family, and I said that my mother and father lived in South London. I got no brothers or sisters. And then she surprised me a bit by saying all of a sudden, "While you're in this house, I'll be your mother." Because she'd said just previously to that, "Oh, your poor mother not know what's happened to you." And I said, "Well, no, I'll just be missing at the time." So when she said this business about while I was in the house, she would be my mother, so to speak, I suppose I was a bit cheeky to her, so I said, "Oh, does that mean I get hugs and kisses?" So she says, "Oh, You may get big, thick and said, you cheeky. Anyway, it started something because Maria seemed to enjoy what I can only call verbal sparring with me. If I said something, she would sort of say something to cap it. And this sort of went on at odd times. So she was very nice. It was all good fun, I suppose. And then they, later in the morning, they left to, I suppose, have their lunch. And the last one then was this young girl from Naples, Carmela. And then I made another mistake. I thought I'd better query her name. And I said, your name is Caramella. No, she said, no, my name is Carmela. Caramella's a sweet. And I thought, oh no, because I said, oh, tongue not working properly. Anyway, we burst out laughing, and Maria and her sister-in-law, I suppose hearing our laughter, came back into the room to ask what was going on. And we had a fit of, Carmela and I had a fit of the giggles. And anyway, eventually Carmela told them what had happened, what I'd said. And I thought that was quite funny. Anyway, they all left and they brought me in something to eat. And then in the afternoon, everybody that had been there in the morning came back in and we chatted again in the afternoon. And Maria suddenly asked me if there's anything I wanted, and I said I was wearing flying boots, of course, at the time, and my feet felt very hot. So I said, well, is it possible to wash my feet? And she said, oh, yes. Anyway, she goes out, Maria, with her sister-in-law, and they asked me to follow them, and they put a bowl of water down on the ground outside the window, and I was able to take my boots off and have a nice drink of, have a nice soak of water with my feet. And while I was doing this, several other people came out, including Maria, and looked at the flying boots that I'd taken off. And they finished up with Maria, and she said these would be nice in the winter. So she said had her feet next to them, and so I said, well, put them on. I said they might be warm from my feet. So she puts the boots on. I zipped them up for her, and she stumped around a bit and said, oh, I make a good airman, though. I said, oh yes, do you only want a parachute now? No, she said, I don't want parachute. I like feet on the ground. And anyway, we go back into the room, and they left eventually, all left to have, I suppose, their evening meal, and then the evening meal was brought to me, and nobody else except Maria and Bruno's elderly mother and Bruno's sister were in the room in the evening. I suppose the rest of Saturday there, and on the at night they took me into the front room of the house downstairs. There was a single bed there, and I'm assuming that was probably normally where Bruno's elderly mother would sleep to save her going up and down stairs. But anyway, they insisted that I sleep there that night, and I spent most of Sunday in the house, and in the afternoon Bruno suddenly appeared and said that I was going to meet up with the rest of my crew that had survived later that evening. So, of course, the first thing I did was to ask him how many, bearing in mind that there were 6 of us in the plane when we had that operation. And he said, oh, there were 4 others apart from me that would be coming. So I asked him, I said, well, the pilot is dead, and he confirmed yes. Apparently his chute hadn't fully opened. I suppose he was too low. Anyway, the evening came, and I suppose it was about 8 o'clock in the evening. There was a sound at the front door of the house. Bruno goes out, and Maria immediately said, the rest of your crew has turned up. So I followed Bruno down, and he was talking to a partisan in the door, and outside were the other 4 members of my crew. I didn't quite get the reception I'd expected. I think our rear gunner saw me coming down and shouted out to me, "Oh, Gordon, we thought you were dead." So I said, well, don't get rid of me that easy. Anyway, cut a long story short, I said goodbye to the others in the house. Carmilla was the last one that I shook hands with, and she put something in my hand, and I said, "What's this?" "Caramella," she said. "Oh," I said, "you not let me forget that." "No," she said, "but I come and visit you." Anyway, we then left with the partisan and went up to the next village called Montanès, through the village, up a stony track, and then it levelled off. On the right was like a horse trough, and a bit further on the left, was a very large shepherd's hut. Standing outside were 4 figures, and we were quickly introduced. They were 3 New Zealand soldiers and an English soldier who'd been there for a week or 2. They were all ex-POWs who'd been released by the Italians when they surrendered in the previous September. And the Italians had simply opened the prison gates, and that was it, and hundreds got out. Most were recaptured quickly by the Germans, and but quite a few got away, including these 4. And anyway, the sun was going down, so we went into the hut. There was sleeping, if you like, grass all laid down one long side of the shepherd's hut, so you could sleep there. At the right-hand end there was a stove, and it was just about plenty of room really for the 9 of us to sleep side by side with a little gap between each of us. And that was the start really of about 4.5 months. What we did during that time was to help the Italians in the fields whenever we could. We made our own breakfast of polenta every morning. We were bought midday meal and a cooked evening meal by a family in the local village of Montanès. I think they were helped with supply of food by the partisans. And we kept asking, if we could sort of make a move to Yugoslavia, and they kept saying not at that time, because the partisans were trying to get a link up between the area where we were and Yugoslavia itself, because as you went from one area to another, different bands of partisans knew that particular area very well. And it finished up that it was about mid-November before they agreed to take two of our party only towards Yugoslavia. And the two that left were the extra man that we had on board that night, a young pilot officer who was on his first trip with us, and also our bomb aimer. I'm not 100% sure, but I think he'd heard prior to our operation that either his father or his mother wasn't very well, and he was anxious to get back. So those two left in mid-November. And at about the same time, the remaining 7 of us went to the partisans' main camp for 2 or 3 weeks. And then on the 1st of December, we started out towards Yugoslavia. Obviously, with that number of people, you've got to have somewhere for them to sleep. You've got to have places where you can get food and so on. And all of this has to be arranged in area by area, right through to Yugoslavia, and that is what had taken the time. But anyway, cut a long story short, we eventually got into Yugoslavia. We got shot at 3 times and water bombed once on our journey there. And then, unfortunately, just inside Yugoslavia, where British and American planes were landed with supplies for the partisans, we couldn't use that because the Germans had bombed it 2 days earlier and it was out of action. So we had to walk further into Yugoslavia, and eventually we were taken by truck by the partisans to a port on the Adriatic coast called Zara. And there was a British and American mission. We went to the American mission and for one night, and the next morning an American Dakota came in with supplies. It was unloaded, we got on board, and we were taken back to South Italy, to Bari.
When the Wellington bomber crew were reunited, they were moved from partisan group to partisan group. Once they reached Yugoslavia, they encountered further problems when the airstrip base had been bombed by the Germans. This meant that they had to return back to Naples in Italy, where they would set sail for Liverpool. When they returned home on the 1st of March 1945, it was finally the end of the war for my grandfather.
The 3 of us from the aircraft, that was myself, Chick Henderson, and the rear gunner, Maddock. We were then met by a corporal from the Air Force with a truck, and we were taken to a house at Maida Vale just off the Edgware Road, and there we were taken up to the 1st floor, given a room each, and we stayed there on the Thursday, and on the Friday morning the 3 of us were taken to Kingsway. I think it was the Kodak building in Kingsway, for a complete medical examination again. I was the first one in, and I was told after the medical that I would be given 8 weeks leave. I came out of the Air Force eventually in about September 46, I went back to my job that I was doing before I joined the Air Force, and we got married. We lived with my parents until 1950. Unfortunately, in 1948, Sylvia had a big ear operation and left her totally deaf in one ear. But anyway, we'd been looking for a house in the South London, in Surrey, Epsom area and so on, all very expensive. And eventually we came over to this side of London and finished up buying this house with the help of my father in 1950. And at about the same time, I got a new job working in the London office of a Manchester company. And I was with them for about 36 years. And it was a very nice job actually, I enjoyed it. And of course in the mid-50s our sons were born. Adrian was born in 1957, and I suppose after a few weeks, once they checked all the information you were given, they sent you two things. One was a card, I don't know if I can all find it all, which says that you are a member of the...
You got it upside down.
No.
member of the club. See
That's
this
great.
Caterpillar Club. Okay, and they also send you a little box, inside of which is a gold caterpillar with your name engraved on the back. I don't know whether you can see that.
Give me a second.
And a matter of 10 or 15 seconds, I've had another 69 years of life. So to me that means life, and in lots of ways means more than perhaps certain forms of decoration. And it's not that I'm against decoration, mind you, but it's very important to me that. And all my life I've always taken the card with me wherever I go, and all the time that I was working until I retired, I always wore my Caterpillar badge on my whatever coat I was wearing, and it was very useful because so few people would recognise it. Most people didn't, and they would ask you what it was and what it was about. And with my job, which took me to all sorts of architects, engineers, building sites, it became a nice talking point, and people became very friendly when you told them about what had happened. So in a way it probably helped my job as well, but it's something which, as I say, I've been very pleased to have all these years, and I still take the card with me wherever I go. I don't talk about what happened to me unless people ask me, then I would tell them. But I don't like to just sort of start off saying, oh, I did so and so. I'm afraid I'm not that type. Anyway, it's been very useful, very helpful, and I'm glad to have my Caterpillar Club and the Caterpillar itself.
Fantastic. Right.